Secrets and Sacrifice, Book 4 in the Shadows series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Jessie Sweeney.
Chapters 11 to 20.
Chapter 11. Grace had no idea what she was coming to. She'd imagined a cold, crumbling castle standing amidst a barren, wind-blown moor, but as they rounded yet another bend, her eyes widened. Instead of a crumbling castle, a solid, sturdy stone mansion covered in creeping ivy and surrounded by the most beautiful flower garden she'd seen in a long time came into view. Spirals of smoke drifted lazily into the pale blue sky from a number of chimneys scattered along the roofline. The house sat on the shore of Loch Lynn. A small jetty ran out into the water from in front of the house, and a number of rowboats and canoes bobbed up and down in the gentle waves. Why hadn't Danny told her it was so beautiful? Danny winked at her. Like it? Grace chuckled. It's stunning. How did you end up on a place like this? I'll tell you one day, if you want to listen. His voice grew serious. Grace groaned. She knew what he'd say. God gave it to us. And she didn't want to hear that rubbish. I think I'll pass. No problem. He brought the van to a stop in front of a smaller stone building to the left of the main house. Long and low, it too was edged with bright, colourful flowers, giving it a very warm and homey feel. Danny smiled broadly as he opened the door for Grayson, then for Brianna and Lizzie. Welcome to Elam Community. 3 young children burst through the front door of the house and ran towards them. The older one, who Grace assumed was Dylan, was wearing a cowboy outfit and ran around pretending to shoot them all. The younger boy James tried to keep up with him, but the little girl went straight to Danny and grabbed his leg. Leaning down, Danny picked Claire up and gave her a big cuddle. Hey there, little one. Daddy's missed you. As he kissed her, Claire threw her arms around his neck. But when he propped her in his arms and stepped closer to Grace and Brianna, her thumb flew straight to her mouth. Look who we've got here, Claire. This is Auntie Grace, and this is Auntie Brianna. Say hello. Claire clung to Danny and buried her head in his chest, but peeked out through her fingers. She really was a daddy's girl. They're not going to bite you, Claire. He tried to pry her head from his chest without success, but then just shook his head. Dylan raced past just then, and Danny grabbed hold of his jacket, bringing him to a sudden stop. Whoa there, Dylan, settle down. We've got guests. Come and say hello to your aunties. As Dylan looked up, Grace sucked in a breath. Dylan had Danny's eyes and cheeky grin. He gave them a quick once-over, said hello, and then escaped his father's hold and raced off again. James stopped beside Lizzie and put his arms up. Lizzie bent over and picked him up, and carried him over to Grace and Brianna. He was tongue-tied, just like his sister. I don't know what's gotten into them. They were so excited before. Lizzie sighed and rolled her eyes. Anyway, let's go inside and I'll get you a cup of tea. She settled James onto her hip and directed Grace and Brianna inside. Grace stood in the entry and gazed around her. This is lovely, Lizzie. The whole place was homely, from the rich rugs on the timber floors to the bright curtains on the windows. The exact opposite of Grace's apartment, which was functional, chic and modern. Danny and Lizzie's house was a family home full of character and love. Thank you, Grace. We didn't know if you'd like it or not. Lizzie laughed and glanced at Danny, who was following behind with their bags. Come into the kitchen and I'll make that tea. Grace and Brianna followed her down a short hallway into a warm, spacious room. A large wood-burning stove with pots and pans hanging above it from hooks attached to the ceiling sat on the far wall. A heavy timber table and a kitchen dresser covered in all sorts of bits and pieces took up the rest of the space. But Grace's eyes were drawn to the view out the window above the sink. The mountains Grace had admired earlier hovered in the distance behind the loch. But in between the house and the loch, a wooden table with bench seats sat amidst a meadow of daisies. It was beautiful. "Coffee or tea?" Lizzie asked as she placed James onto one of the chairs and gave him a colouring book and some pencils. "Coffee, thanks," Grace replied. "Coffee for me too, please." Grace's eyes widened. Brianna spoke. Amazing. Grace's eyes widened further as Brianna picked up a pencil and began colouring with James. Never in her wildest dreams had Grace expected Brianna to do such a thing. Who would have thought? "Would you like to see your room, Grace? I can show you while the kettle's boiling." Lizzie twirled a finger through her hair as her eyes darted to Brianna and back. Grace got the message and followed Lizzie back down the hallway and into a clean, tidy room filled with 2 single beds and an old timber dresser. A bunch of freshly cut flowers sat on the dresser, filling the room with a sweet perfume. Cream fluffy towels and flannels sat on the end of each bed. The room had the same outlook as the kitchen. She'd like lying in bed and gazing out at those mountains. Maybe she could consider climbing them one day. She blinked. Since when did Grace O'Connor climb mountains? She chuckled to herself. It must be the Highland air getting to her. "This is lovely, Lizzie. Thank you." Without thinking about it, Grace reached for Lizzie's hand and squeezed it. When she realized what she'd done, she quickly withdrew it. "Our pleasure, Grace. Danny and I really hope you enjoy your stay." Lizzie's smile was genuine and warm. "You know, ever since Danny found out you were coming, he's been so excited, and a little nervous." Lizzie let out a small chuckle as she sat on the bed and motioned for Grace to join her. Her expression grew serious as she met Grace's gaze. "Is there anything we need to know about Brianna? How long have you got?" Grace raised her brow, but then realized she shouldn't be so flippant about such a serious matter. "Sorry. She's a drug addict, Lizzie, but you already know that. Just be careful. She'll steal and lie if she's desperate. Keep a good eye on her." There was so much more she could say, but really, that was enough. "We've had others like her through here, so we know what to expect. We'll do our best for her, Grace." Lizzie took Grace's hand and squeezed it. Tears pricked Grace's eyes. She was sure Lizzie and Danny would do the best they could for BB, but would it be enough? And would she even stay? Whistling sounded from the kitchen. Lizzie released Grace's hand and hurried back to the kitchen. Grace followed. Brianna was still colouring with James, and a smile grew on Grace's face. Danny arrived with Claire and placed her beside James. Dylan was still running around, but stopped when Lizzie offered him cake. "Now sit down and eat quietly with your brother and sister," Lizzie said as she placed 3 plastic plates on the table with a slice of homemade chocolate cake on each. She made coffee and tea, and then placed a larger plate on the table with the remainder of the cake. "I love this place, Danny. Did you do it all yourself?" Grace asked as Danny took a seat at the head of the table, on either side of Claire and Dylan. Danny laughed. "No, we had a lot of help from the boys." "The students, you mean? How many are there?" Grace glanced away and smiled at Lizzie as she took a small slice of the cake she was passing around. "It varies. Right now we have 7 boys and 6 girls, including Brianna, but we've had up to 20. "That's a lot. You must have other people helping." Lizzie nodded enthusiastically as she gulped down a mouthful of tea. "We're lucky to have some highly qualified and experienced staff members. I hope you don't mind." Lizzie glanced at Grace and then at Brianna, "but we've asked them over for supper." Grace glanced at Brianna to check her reaction. Brianna hardly flinched and just kept colouring. Why would they do that? And on her first night? She really didn't need to meet the staff, but seemed she'd have no choice. Grace forced a smile. "That will be lovely, Lizzie." "They're keen to meet you both. It's always good when family members come to visit. Danny and I haven't had any family here since my parents visited a year ago." Grace sipped her coffee. "Your parents must have enjoyed seeing their grandchildren." Lizzie sat beside Grace and picked up her cup of tea. "Very much so, and the kids absolutely adored having them here. The twins were only babies, but it was still wonderful, and such a surprise. My father was always so formal and standoffish, but you should have seen him down on the floor giving horsey rides to the twins. They wouldn't leave him alone. Lizzie leaned back in her seat and smiled. And Mother? Well, she was the one who got our garden sorted. Lizzie chuckled. I'd always wanted a house with a lovely garden, and now I have it. You must get snow here in winter. What do you do then? Oh, Mother showed me how to keep the seeds and bulbs to plant in early spring, and it worked. I was so surprised when the first shoots came up. In fact, we had a party to celebrate. The chatter continued around the table, but Brianna didn't join in. Instead, she hid herself in the colouring book, just lifting her head occasionally. At least she was still here. That was something. But Grace got the feeling she wasn't okay. She knew her too well. Grace pushed back her chair. I think we might freshen up before dinner if you don't mind. Lizzie jumped up. Oh, I'm sorry. You both must be tired. Feel free to take a bath or shower and have a rest if you like. Dinner for the adults isn't until 7, so there's plenty of time. Thanks. Grace smiled at Lizzie as she placed her hand lightly on Brianna's shoulder and motioned for her to follow. When Grace and Brianna were on their own in the bedroom, Grace sat beside Brianna on one of the beds and put her arm around her. What's up, baby? Something's wrong. What is it? Brianna shrugged and hung her head. They're all so nice. I won't fit in. Oh, baby, don't feel like that. They're family, and they want you to feel welcome. Grace lifted Brianna's chin and turned her face towards her. Brianna's eyes were filled with tears. Grace pulled her close and hugged her, brushing her hair with her hand. I'm sure it'll be okay. Just give it time. But I'll keep my promise and take you home if you want to leave. Brianna didn't reply. Instead, she pulled away and curled up on the bed, hugging a pillow to her chest as she closed her eyes. As Grace looked at Brianna's pitiful frame, hopes of ever getting her well faded and despair for her sister's future grew. Chapter 12. An hour or so later, Grace managed to get Brianna showered and dressed, and they headed back towards the kitchen. The rest seemed to have done Brianna good. At least she was prepared to leave the room and come for dinner. The sound of a piano playing drew them into a cosy living room where Lizzie sat at a piano beside Dylan. He was propped on a cushion so he could reach the keys, and he looked so cute. And could he play? He and Lizzie were playing together, and whilst Lizzie was the better player, Dylan was doing a great job for a 4-year-old. Grace and Brianna stood at the door listening until Lizzie must have sensed their presence and turned around. Don't let us stop you, Grace said. You're both great. The cheeky smile on Dylan's face made Grace laugh. I don't know how you got him to sit still for so long, though. That's part of the bargain. If he wants to run around like a tornado, he also has to do piano lessons. No lessons, no play. It's that simple, isn't it, Dylan? Lizzie ruffled his hair and he nodded eagerly, looking up into his mother's face with a cheeky grin, just like his father's. Lizzie and Danny were so lucky to have such lovely children. Who would have thought that her brother, Daniel O'Connor, ex-alcoholic, would turn out to be such a model husband and father, and manager of a place such as this? Amazing. We were just finishing up anyway. It's almost bedtime for the children. Come and tuck them in with me. Lizzie stood and closed the piano lid, and then led Grace and Brianna into the children's bedrooms. Dylan ran ahead, grabbing Grace's hand and dragging her with him.
Come on, Auntie Grace, you can read me a story.
Grace shuddered, but chuckled at the same time. What could she do? She didn't have a choice. Lizzie sprinted after him and grabbed his pyjama top, managing to stop him just before he reached his room. Whoa there, Dylan, slow down, you'll pull your auntie's arm off. Dylan had his own little room next to the twins' room, and he pulled Grace in there and directed her to sit on his bed while he chose a book from his bookshelf. His floor was covered with toy trucks and cars. Dylan jumped onto the bed and presented her with his book of choice. Grace groaned. Of course it would be a Bible story book. She rarely read to Caleb and Caitlin's girls, but when she did, they usually chose Bible stories too, and Grace always struggled to read them. Mainly because of the memories they brought back. Memories of happier times when Mam was still alive. And she'd gather the children around at bedtime and read to them all. Mam loved her Bible stories, but what made it worse, she actually believed them. Mam had a simple faith, and it annoyed Grace. God hadn't saved her in the end, so what use was he? Surely if he loved her like Mam said he did, he would have healed her, and then they could all have stayed together as a family, and she and Brianna wouldn't have gone to Aunt Hilda's. And Brianna wouldn't have been raped by her cousins. And Grace wouldn't have.
Are you going to read it, Auntie Grace?
Dylan's little voice interrupted her thoughts. Yes, I'm sorry, Dylan. Grace quickly opened the book and began reading, pushing her memories away. When Grace reached the end, Dylan promptly asked if she could read another. I don't think so. I think it's time for bed. I can hear your mum finishing up with the twins. Do you need to clean your teeth and go to the toilet? Dylan pushed his bottom lip out.
I don't like cleaning my teeth.
You need to look after them or they'll fall out. His little face lit up.
That's what Da says.
Grace sucked in a breath. Dylan's reference to Da brought a sudden memory of her own Da, that horrid man who'd caused all their problems. Just as well Danny was nothing like him. Just then, Danny appeared at the door and Dylan jumped up and ran into his arms.
Daddy, you made it!
You bet I did, little man. Danny spun Dylan round, and then plonked him down on the bed beside Grace. Have you been good for Auntie Grace?
I'm always good.
Danny laughed. Yes, right. And did she read you? Danny glanced at Grace and winked at her.
Yes, she read me Noah's Ark.
That's about the 100th time you've had that book read to you. Maybe you should pick a different one tomorrow night.
But it's my favourite, Daddy.
Yes, I know, and it's a grand story. Anyway, I believe it's bedtime, so off you go. Toilet, teeth, and bed.
And prayers.
Yes, and prayers.
Can Auntie Grace pray with me?
Grace stiffened. Please don't ask me to do that. Danny glanced at her, briefly meeting her gaze. I'm sure Auntie Grace would love to pray with you, Dylan, wouldn't she? Grace narrowed her eyes and glared at Danny. He knew she wouldn't want to pray. The hide of him to put her on the spot like that. As much as it irked her, she'd have to go along with it to keep Dylan happy. So she put on a happy face, but spoke through clenched teeth. Of course I'll pray with you, Dylan. Just as soon as you've cleaned your teeth and been to the toilet. In the next room, Lizzie was doing much the same with the twins. Brianna was with them, and Grace had heard James ask if she could read to them, but Lizzie had stepped in and said maybe Auntie Brianna could read to him another time. Thank goodness Lizzie seemed to understand where Brianna was at. Dylan cleaned his teeth in record time and was back in the room waiting for Grace to say prayers with him. Danny had gone into the twins' room, so Grace had no option but to get down on her knees beside Dylan. But there was no way she was going to steeple her hands like he was doing.
Will you go first, Auntie Grace?
He looked at her with his sweet, innocent face, almost melting her heart. How had she gotten herself into this position? Grace O'Connor, barrister, atheist, murderer, kneeling on the floor with a 4-year-old, praying to a God she didn't believe in. She couldn't do it. Why don't you go first, Dylan?
Okay.
He squeezed his eyes shut and began.
Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for bringing Auntie Grace to stay with us, and the other auntie, I can't remember her name. Mum says she needs your help. So Lord Jesus, can you please help her? I'm sorry for being naughty for Mia today, and please help me to have a good sleep tonight. Thank you for loving me, and for giving me my Mum and Da, and James and Claire. I love them lots. Amen.
He looked up and smiled.
It's your turn.
Grace gulped. How could she pray? She'd vowed she'd never talk to God again after Mam's funeral, and she hadn't. But this little 4-year-old had put her on the spot, and she'd have to break her promise. Okay, close your eyes. She gulped. This was not going to be easy. Dear God, thank you for Dylan and for his love of life, and thank you for bringing me here so I can spend time with him and with his mom and dad. Watch over him tonight as he sleeps, and let us have a good day tomorrow. Amen. Grace quickly brushed unexpected tears from her eyes, but not quickly enough.
Are you crying, Auntie Grace?
Dylan's little face peered up at her. No. She brushed the last tear away and sucked in a breath. Come on, let's get you to bed.
I need my animals. I take 3 to bed. Mouse, Rabbit, and Fred. Here they are.
He put the 3 stuffed animals under his blankets and snuggled down with them.
Good night, Auntie Grace. I love you.
As he smiled up at her, tears pricked her eyes again. She bent down and kissed him on the cheek. I love you too, Dylan. Night-night. Sleep tight.
Good night.
She stepped back and tiptoed out of the room, flicked the light switch, and bumped into Danny just outside the room. You did good, Grace. Dylan's taken with you. He squeezed her hand as he whispered, I knew he would be. Grace shrugged. I don't know why. I told him you're a very clever person and that you wear a wig when you're at work, and that you're my little sister, just like Claire's his little sister. Danny stepped towards her and hugged her before drawing back and meeting her gaze. And that did it for him, Grace. You're now his favourite auntie. Grace couldn't help it. She blinked back unwelcome tears that sprang to her eyes as mixed emotions assailed her. Danny brushed her tears away with his thumb and drew her close. It's so good to have you here, Grace. His voice was soft and caring, and she knew he meant it. But drat the man. He had a knack of getting through her carefully constructed walls and exposing her inner feelings, and she couldn't allow that to happen. Grace sucked a deep, slow breath and regained her control. Thanks, Danny. It's good to be here. Come on now. Supper must almost be ready, and there are people waiting to meet you. Grace groaned. A nice quiet evening with Danny and Lizzie would have been preferable. Now she'd have to put up all her defences, since no doubt all the people waiting to meet her and Brianna were Christians, and that was not something she looked forward to at all. Chapter 13. Grace followed Danny down the hallway into a larger room she hadn't noticed before. Tucked away at the other side of the kitchen, it served as a dining room and lounge room all in one. Brianna was already seated on the edge of an older brown leather couch, looking very uncomfortable. Lizzie, perched on the arm of the couch beside her, was talking to another shorter, chubbier woman who wore a pleasant smile. Brianna looked up as Grace entered the room and shot her a plea for help. As Grace stepped closer to Brianna and Lizzie, a man, possibly in his early 40s, entered from the door at the far end. Her heart skipped a beat. Acutely conscious of his tall, athletic physique, her eyes were drawn to him like bees to a honeypot. His smile was wide and warm as Danny clapped his arm around the man's shoulders. Ryan, great to see you. Come and meet my sisters. Grace quickly pulled herself together as Danny steered Ryan towards the group at the couch, but she couldn't stop the ripple of excitement that flowed through her as his brilliant blue eyes met hers. Danny smiled as he made the introductions, seemingly unaware of the undercurrents flowing between her and this hunk of a man. Grace, Brianna, meet my good friend and co-worker, Ryan McGregor. Ryan, these are my sisters, Grace and Brianna. Grace raised her brow slightly as she took Ryan's outstretched hand, which was firm, warm and masculine. Nice to meet you, Grace. His voice was just as warm as the touch of his hand. With a name like McGregor, she had expected a broad Scots accent, but instead he spoke with an English one. She was almost disappointed. "And nice to meet you too, Ryan." Her voice was low and husky as she held his gaze. "I've heard a lot about you, Grace." His blue eyes sparkled, and his hand remained in hers slightly longer than would normally be expected on occasions such as this. "All good, I hope?" She gave a small laugh. "Of course. Danny wouldn't have a bad word to say about anyone." Ryan elbowed Danny gently in the ribs and chuckled. "I can always count on you to build me up, Rye, old man." Danny gave Ryan a playful punch on the arm. Grace laughed at their friendly banter. Supper with the staff might be fun after all. Still very much aware of Ryan's presence beside her, Grace tore her eyes away and glanced at Brianna as Ryan shook her hand. Grace winced as Brianna only managed a cursory smile. Brianna certainly gave the impression she didn't want to be here, but then Danny and Lizzie would be used to that, from what Lizzie had said. The chubby young woman who was introduced as Emily sat beside Brianna and began chatting when Lizzie excused herself. Grace returned her attention to Ryan, quirking her eyebrows. "And what do you do here?" Danny squeezed her shoulder before Ryan could answer. "I'll leave you to it, sis. I need to help Lizzie." He promptly disappeared into the kitchen, leaving her alone with Ryan. Amusement flickered in Ryan's face. "I'm in charge of the outdoor program." "Of course, that would make sense. What types of things do you do?" He shrugged. "Depends on the season, but in summer, like now, we do all sorts. Mountain climbing, hiking, abseiling, rafting, rowing, and in winter, tobogganing and cross-country skiing. But there's also an indoor gym, so most of winter's spent in there." Grace angled her head. "The students get to do all that?" Ryan nodded. "Yep. It's often the first time any of them have done anything like this, so it can be a real challenge for them. But they usually love it once they get over their initial fear." He smiled at her, sending another ripple of excitement flowing through her. "Can I get you a drink, Grace?" "Thought you'd never ask. Gin and tonic, thanks." Ryan laughed as if he was sincerely amused. "You won't get one of those here, Grace. Sorry. It's a soft drink or punch." She let out a frustrated sigh. She should have realized. Of course they wouldn't serve alcohol here. What was she thinking? She drew in a breath. "Guess I'll have a punch." He steered her towards a table where a punch bowl sat and poured 2 glasses before handing her one. "First time in the Highlands?" She nodded. "I can take you into the mountains one day if you'd like." She raised a brow. "Hiking?" "We can drive if you prefer." His eyes twinkled. She chuckled. "Driving sounds good. Let me think about it." She took a sip of her punch. Stepping closer, he lowered his voice. "Danny told me a little about your sister. She's come to the right place." Grace rubbed the back of her neck and blew out a breath. "She doesn't want to be here." Most of the new students say that when they first arrive, but it usually takes a day or 2, and then we can't get them to leave. Grace shrugged. "Guess we'll see." "Come on, supper's served." He cupped her elbow with his hand and directed her to the table, where he pulled a chair out for her before taking a seat next to her. Brianna sat on the opposite side of the table between Emily and Lizzie. Danny sat to Lizzie's right, and then another older woman who introduced herself as Rosemary sat on the other side. Rosemary had a broad Scottish accent and taught sewing and piano. She also oversaw the female students' general welfare and was the first person they should see if they had any issues or concerns. Emily was in charge of the kitchen and other domestic duties. The last person at the table was David, Rosemary's husband. Like Rosemary, David also had a broad Scottish accent. He was in charge of the Bible school, and also oversaw the male students' welfare. Grace learned during the course of the evening that Lizzie also taught basic literacy skills in the school, as often students arrived without being able to read or write. But the one who surprised Grace the most was Danny. He taught classes in basic Christianity. So who funds all of this? Grace asked Ryan during a break in the meal, which was being served by two of the students. It was a blunt question, but someone had to be paying for it all, and Grace was curious. The students obviously weren't paying. Ryan chuckled before sipping his drink and leaning closer. A lot of people wonder that. David and Rosemary own the property, and a number of interested people provide financial support. And I've got my army pension, so we get by. You're in the army? Grace's eyes shot open. Yes, for just over 22 years. Grace did a quick calculation. That would make him in his early 40s, depending on when he joined. Where did you serve? She held her breath. Ryan angled his head. You really want to know? Grace nodded. She didn't, but she couldn't help herself. She had to know. What if he was in Londonderry when the bomb went off? Well, the British weren't involved in Vietnam, thank God. But I was in the Aden conflict, and then I got tangled up with the troubles in Ireland in the late 60s and early 70s. Grace felt the blood drain out of her face. Her heart raced and she bit her lip. She had to get a grip on herself. She couldn't allow even a smidgen of concern to show. Besides, he was probably in Belfast, not Londonderry. And I was in Malaysia and also the Falklands. He leaned closer. Best not to make this public, but I was in the Special Forces. Grace's eyes widened. Why was he telling her all of this? And why would a man like Ryan, who'd obviously seen so much action, choose to come and work in a place like this, with a mob of drug addicts and dropouts? It didn't make sense. Surely he'd be bored stiff. She would be. She was already missing the challenge of the courtroom, and that was nothing like the adrenaline rush she imagined Ryan would have gotten from being in the field. So how are you finding it here? It must be tame after what you're used to. She tried to keep her voice calm, natural. Yes, it is, but the thrill of helping these kids and seeing them face challenges they've never dreamed of facing before is worth it. It's such a rewarding job, especially when most of them come to know God. Grace blinked. God. Surely this burly ex-Special Forces soldier didn't believe in God. Surely after all the evil and hatred he would have seen, he'd be more cynical about God than ever. But here he was talking about God as if he was the most natural thing in the world. Something told Grace Ryan meant it, and just like Lizzie and Danny, his faith would be utterly genuine. Dessert was served, saving Grace the need to provide some kind of answer to Ryan's last statement. For now. If she got the chance to spend more time with him, no doubt it would come up again, and she'd have to have a response ready. Following dessert, Ryan pushed his chair back. Sorry, folks, I'm going to have to leave you. Early start in the morning and all. He smiled at everyone and then leaned closer to Grace, whispering in her ear. Let me know when you want to do that hike. And then he was gone. The evening was finished as far as Grace was concerned. She had no inclination to strike up a conversation with any of the others, especially the older couple who she guessed could be quite boring, especially after Ryan. Who wanted to talk about Bible school, sewing and piano? Or cooking or domestic duties? No, the only person of interest here was Ryan, apart from Danny and Lizzie, of course. I think I might head off too, if you'll excuse me. Grace wiped her mouth with a napkin and pushed her chair back. It's been a lovely evening, thank you all. She nodded to each person in turn, and then made eyes at Brianna.
I need to go to bed too.
Brianna took the hint. She stood and thanked everyone before leaving with Grace. Grace turned as Lizzie caught them just outside the kitchen. Grabbing both their hands, Lizzie gave them a warm smile. "I hope you both sleep well. Let me know if you need anything." "Thanks, Lizzie. I'm sure we'll be fine." Grace returned her smile. "Thanks for a lovely evening." "Our pleasure, Grace. I'm so glad you enjoyed yourselves." Lizzie leaned forward and hugged and kissed them in turn before saying good night. Once in their room, Brianna climbed into bed fully dressed. "Are you okay, Bibi?" Grace eased herself onto the bed and brushed the hair off Brianna's forehead with her fingers. Brianna sighed and closed her eyes. "I'm tired, and I'm sick of talking. That's all they seem to do." Her voice trailed away as she rolled over and faced the wall, curling into a ball as she always did, as if she just wanted to hide from the world. Grace leaned over and hugged her. "It'll be all right, Bibi. Just get some sleep." She rubbed Brianna's back gently until her breathing slowed and her body relaxed. Grace tiptoed away and prepared for bed, but as she lay in bed, sleep eluded her as her mind drifted back to the day that had haunted her for so long. She'd only been 16, young and rebellious, and looking for a cause to follow. Something that would relieve the boredom of life in Londonderry. Chapter 14. Londonderry, 1969.
"Fergus has agreed to meet you after school."
Grace's best friend Samara whispered to her one boring Wednesday lunchtime in the school cafeteria. 16-year-old Grace's face lit up at the prospect of something new happening in her life. Aunt Hilda treated her and Brianna like they were servants, not relatives, and Grace was sick of it. She didn't care if she got into trouble for being late to do her chores. Samara had been telling her about Fergus for some time, and finally she was getting the chance to meet him. Not that she believed for a second that was his real name. But that only added more to the intrigue and mystery.
"That's great, Sammy. Will you be there too?"
"Yes, I'll come. Meet me at the main gate and we'll catch the 3:11 into town." Grace smiled at her. "I'll be there." As they alighted from the 3:11 in downtown Derry and made their way first along Bishop Street and then through a rabbit warren of narrow alleys full of overflowing rubbish cans, stray cats and ancient crooked buildings, Grace's heart beat with anticipation. Finally, she was getting a chance to do something exciting. Ever since she and Brianna had come to live with Aunt Hilda and Uncle Dougal after Mam died, she'd been longing for some excitement to replace the everyday drudgery of life in the tiny house in the suburbs of Londonderry. The troubles had begun a year ago, but having been kept on such a tight leash by Aunt Hilda, Grace hadn't seen any of it firsthand. Although explosions and gunfire could often be heard in the distance, and occasionally helicopters would fly overhead. But she wanted to see it for herself, and now she was 16, she was prepared to stand up to Aunt Hilda and get a life. Sammy finally stopped in front of a nondescript door in a narrow alleyway and knocked 3 times. A voice from inside called out some unintelligible word, and Sammy replied with the word potato. Seemed it was the word the person inside was looking for, because the door creaked open. Grace squinted. The shades were drawn over the solitary window, and she gagged at the smell of stale cigarettes and beer. Steeling herself, Grace followed Sammy inside. Sammy stopped in front of the table littered with wires and cables and bits of tin and metal. On the other side of the table sat a man with a big bushy beard and a cap drawn low over his eyes. "Fergus, this is my friend Faith." Grace clenched her hands and inched closer to Sammy and the table. Her heart raced. Now the moment was here. Could she really go through with it? What would Sammy think if she pulled out now? No, she had to hold herself together and go ahead with this meeting and prove to Fergus that she was capable of doing what was required. Fergus leaned back in his chair, folded his arms and sized her up. Grace bit her lip to stop it quivering. "So, Faith, what makes you think you might be of use to us?" His voice was deeper than she had expected, and slightly gravelly, as if he was trying to disguise it. Sammy pushed her forward. Grace swallowed hard. "Well, sir, I believe in the cause, and I'm smart and I'm quick." Her voice was less confident than she'd hoped it would be. "Smart, huh? Mary here has told me you're top in your class. Bit of a whiz kid." "I don't know about that, sir, but I think I've been blessed with a decent brain." Fergus continued to study her. Grace forced herself to stand still, although she was itching to turn around and flee. "Mary said we can trust you. She'd better be right." He paused, as if he was weighing up whether he could really trust her or not. He lit a cigarette and blew smoke out of the corner of his mouth. The glow from the cigarette highlighted the red in his beard. Grace jumped as he leaned forward and folded his arms on the table. "You'll have 2 classes, and after that you'll be given your first assignment. You're not to say a word to anyone. Mary's already been chastised for talking to you." He glanced at Sammy. "We normally do our own recruiting." Grace gulped. "Thank you, sir." She got the feeling that something was going on between the two of them, and she felt sick in her stomach at the thought of it. Sammy had never said anything directly, but a few things she'd said now made sense. How could Sammy do that? Fergus was a disgusting creep. "One thing, don't call me sir." "Okay, thank you, sir. Sorry, Fergus." Grace needed to get out before she vomited. She was panting and couldn't steady her breathing. "Read this and memorize it. You got 10 seconds and then I'll have it back." Grace took the paper and read it carefully. Details of her classes were scrawled in untidy capital letters. She committed them to memory and handed the paper back. Fergus lit a match and held the paper up, making sure it was alight before tossing it in the bin. "That's all. Good afternoon, ladies." He glanced at Sammy and ever so slightly nodded his head at her. Was Sammy planning on coming back later? What excuse did she give her mam for being out so often? Grace gulped. Did she really know what she was getting herself into? Once back outside in the alleyway, Grace gulped in lungfuls of air and steadied her breathing. If only she'd pulled out then. But she couldn't lose face with Sammy. And so she pretended she was impressed with Fergus and feigned her excitement about the classes. The following day, she told Aunt Hilda she was going to Sammy's place after school to work on a joint assignment. But instead she went to her first class. Being clever, Grace picked up the art of bomb-making very quickly. But what interested her the most was finding out which wire to pull out so it wouldn't go off. She couldn't ask directly, but by the time she'd completed her second class, she'd worked it out herself. And with that knowledge, she left the class with details of her first assignment scribbled on a piece of paper. Right from the moment the girls arrived, Hilda resented them. She'd never wanted to take the girls in, but Dougal had spoken and she had no say in the matter. "They're just poor wee lassies without a mam or dad, Hilda love. We have to offer them a home." He wrapped his stinking arms around her and breathed his foul breath on her. And then he told her he'd earn extra money so they could afford to feed and clothe them. What a fool she'd been to believe him. Whatever extra money he might have earned, he spent at the pub on the way home. She never saw a penny of it. She rarely spoke to the girls apart from giving them chores to do. The boys resented them too, and made faces at the girls, especially the youngest one who was much quieter than the older one. She sat in the corner and sucked her thumb, even though she was 10 when they arrived. She wet her bed every night too. Hilda made the older girl wash the stinking bed. Why should she have to do it? But Grace was the sly one. She was too smart for her own good, and Hilda despised her even more with every day and year that passed. She knew Grace was up to something when she was quieter than usual one morning at the breakfast table. She'd grown into quite a striking teenager, and Hilda had noticed Dougal's not-so-direct interest in her. But what did she care? She couldn't stand the man touching her anymore. So if he was able to satisfy his needs with this young hussy, She should be grateful. But the airs and graces that girl put on. Who did she think she was? She should leave school and get a job that'd bring her back down to earth, but Dougal wouldn't allow it. She's the clever one, Hilda, love. She can become anything she chooses. Leave her alone. But Hilda kept watch, and this morning she had a feeling she was onto something. After the girls left for school, she quietly opened the door to their tiny back room and closed it behind her. No one was home, but still it paid to be careful. She scanned the room. Rarely had she come in here, just on the odd occasion when she had extra jobs for them to do, but then she'd only stand in the doorway. The room was barely big enough for the two girls. As she eased her large frame onto the bed, it squeaked and sagged in the middle. At least the bedding was clean. On the faded timber bookcase, a lone photo sat in front of a row of books. Hilda reached for it and studied it. The woman must be their mam. She held a babe in her arms, and was surrounded by 7 other children ranging in ages from about 2 to early teens. Hilda peered closer. It must have been taken not long before she died. She picked out Grace and Brianna and was tempted to tear the photo up. Instead, she replaced it carefully. Her gaze moved slowly around the room. There had to be something. The girls were surprisingly neat, but then again, they didn't have much to be untidy with. Her gaze settled on a notebook on the desk. She picked it up and flicked through it. Nothing. Then a scrumpled up piece of paper in the bin caught her attention. Hilda leaned over and picked it up. She smoothed out the creases and tried to read the few words that had been written in neat handwriting. She wasn't that illiterate, but could only make out a few words. Friday 13th, November, stop 20, 4 p.m. Somehow, she knew this was what she'd been looking for. She shoved it into her apron pocket and after standing, smoothed the bed covers and backed out of the room with a smile on her face. She'd catch that young hussy once and for all. Studying with Samara? Sure. And the Queen's my mother. All day at school, Grace couldn't concentrate. She glanced at the clock on the wall every few minutes. Every now and then, Sammy kicked her and she turned her attention back to the algebra she was supposed to be doing, or the Shakespeare she was meant to be reading. Finally, the bell rang, and Grace quickly packed her books into her backpack. Her stomach convulsed. She just made it to the toilet block before vomiting violently into the bowl. Anyone who saw her probably thought she was pregnant, but that was impossible. Despite all Uncle Dougal's attempts, she'd never once given in to him. Her acrid tongue and sharp words had somehow keeping him at bay. But it had backfired, and he was now paying Brianna attention. Grace wasn't sure if Brianna was strong enough to hold him off much longer. But that was the least of her concerns right now. She stood slowly and wiped her mouth. Sweat dripped off her forehead, despite the chill of the day. "Grace, are you okay?" Sammy called from the other side of the door. Grace inhaled slowly and forced herself to reply. "Yep, coming." Sammy didn't know today was the day. Nobody knew, apart from her and Gregor, her teacher. And Fergus, no doubt. "I've got to go home today, Sammy," Grace said when she finally opened the door. "I just remembered Aunt Hilda needed me to do some extra chores this afternoon. Sorry." She planted a smile on her face and hoped she hadn't given anything away. "I'll catch you Monday, if not before." Sammy narrowed her eyes, but didn't say anything. She probably guessed, but what did it matter? "Okay then, see you Monday." As she began to walk away, she stopped and turned. "Come over tomorrow if you want." Grace lifted her hand and smiled. She could see it in her eyes. Sammy knew. Left on her own, Grace returned to the toilet cubicle and opened her backpack. So many times she'd played this over in her mind, but now she had to do it for real. Carefully lifting the device she'd made during her class out of her backpack, Grace set the timer for 4 p.m. Less than 30 minutes to get to the bus stop, plant it, and get out of the area. Before replacing the package in her backpack, Grace did one more thing. She carefully picked up the white wire, but instead of connecting it to the terminal, she left it hanging. Maybe she'd be excused for not tightening it up properly, since it was her first mission. But Grace doubted Fergus would let her off that easily. She'd be expelled from the group, but she couldn't do what they were asking. She'd just have to suffer whatever penalty he doled out if he realised what she'd done. Chapter 15. Elim Community, 1985. Grace sprang up in bed. Her heart pounded like a hammer drill, and sweat dropped from her forehead in beads, landing on her already sodden bedclothes. Where was she? She held her hand to her chest and calmed her breathing. The first rays of daylight peeked through the window. In the other bed, Brianna stretched and turned over. Grace remembered. She was at Danny and Lizzie's, and meeting Ryan must have triggered that horrible memory. If only she hadn't gone to the bus stop that afternoon, everything would have been so different for both her and Brianna. The bomb shouldn't have gone off. Her stomach convulsed again, just recalling the images of bodies flying through the air. And the noise. It shouldn't have happened. How had she made the mistake? She knew which wire to leave off. She knew what she was doing. It was quite simple. But somehow she'd made an error. A fatal error. How had she lived with herself all these years knowing she'd killed all those innocent people? She'd been 100 yards away when the bomb went off. She stopped and turned as if it was happening in slow motion. Her heart stopped beating for what seemed ages as people ran all around her trying to get as far away as possible. Someone pulled her along, but she kept turning her head to see what was happening. Within seconds, sirens screamed as response teams raced to the site. Soldiers intermingled with police as the area was cordoned off, and then Grace was pulled around a corner and could no longer see the devastation she'd caused. "Best get home quickly, miss," a man said. She had no recollection of what he looked like. The only image in her head was of bodies lying on the ground amongst the debris, along with the memory of the smell of smoke and dust that stung her nostrils. She could never forget. She found the nearest train station and ran into the toilets, where she retched violently into the putrid bowl until nothing was left in her stomach. How long she remained there she had no idea. Finally, she cleaned herself up and made her way home. Aunt Hilda wasn't in the kitchen. Strange, since she was always there. Grace breathed a sigh of relief and went straight to her room, closing the door behind her. Brianna lay on the bed, curled in a ball and sobbing. Her clothes were ripped and strewn over the edge of the bed and the floor. Grace's heart pounded again. Throwing her bag down, she bent over Brianna, turning her over slowly. She peered into Bibi's eyes. "Bibi, what's happened?" Grace could barely speak. Brianna's sobs increased, and Grace gently pulled her up and hugged her until she settled. Grace had a feeling she knew what had happened. Uncle Dougal had finally had his way. Her blood boiled. She'd report that brute to the police. But when Brianna finally spoke and whispered, "The boys," Grace could hardly believe it. She pulled Brianna closer and hugged her tighter. "Both of them?" Grace asked quietly. Brianna nodded. Grace's chest heaved with anger. If only she'd come straight home from school, this wouldn't have happened. "I'm going to report them." Brianna shook her head. "No, please don't." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why not, for heaven's sake? They've raped you, Brianna." A fresh round of sobs assailed her, and Grace pulled her close once more. "Well, I'm going to tell Aunt Hilda for a start." Grace gently laid Brianna back on the bed and tucked a blanket around her. "I'll come back and clean you up in a minute." Grace left the room and strode into the kitchen. This time, Aunt Hilda was there, and she had a smirk on her face. Grace's blood boiled. She strode straight up to her and stood over her. She was already a foot taller than her aunt. "Do you know what your boys have just done?" She didn't recognize the voice coming out of her mouth. It was so determined and full of hate and anger. Aunt Hilda didn't reply, but she held her ground and met Grace's angry gaze. "Well, do you?" Grace stepped closer. "I'll tell you what they've done. They've just raped Brianna, that's what. And I'm off to report them." Aunt Hilda laughed. "You do that, Missy, and I'll tell them who planted that bomb." Grace sucked in a breath and stopped dead. She stared at Aunt Hilda. How did she know? Grace's whole world crumbled. They couldn't stay here a moment longer. She gave Aunt Hilda one final stare and then turned and fled. "Come on, baby, we've got to get out of here." She helped Brianna up, quickly cleaned her and helped her dress.
"What's happened, Grace? Why do we need to go?"
Brianna's voice was weak and weary. "Trust me. You don't want to know. We just need to get out of here." Grace pulled a bag from under the bed and quickly threw in as much as she could. Changing out of her school uniform, she climbed into a pair of jeans and put on her thickest shirt and jacket. "Okay, let's go." As she pushed Brianna out the door, she glanced in the bin. A heavy weight landed in the pit of her stomach. The scrunched-up piece of paper she'd tossed away in disgust wasn't there. She swallowed hard. It was too late. They snuck out the back door and into the narrow laneway that ran behind the houses. Darkness had set in along with the chill of the night. Grace had no idea where they'd go. They just had to get as far away as possible. And quickly. Dogs barked as they passed behind each of the neighbouring houses. Grace wished they'd stop. Would Aunt Hilda come after them? Or worse still, would she send the boys? Grace's heart was already thumping, but the thought of facing those two disgusting, vile creatures made her blood boil. She dragged Brianna along with her until they reached the end of the lane. They headed the opposite way they'd normally go, and weaved in and out of the lanes running through the area until they reached the main road out of town. Grace put out her thumb and hoped they'd be picked up by someone quickly, praying that whoever picked them up wouldn't take advantage of the two young girls out on their own on a cold winter's night. Brianna stirred, bringing Grace back to the present. Brianna rubbed her eyes as she pulled herself up onto her pillows. "Good morning, baby. Did you sleep okay?" Grace forced herself to sound normal. Brianna shrugged.
"Same as usual."
"I know, baby." And Grace did know. Neither of them had had a good night's sleep since that fateful day. They were each tormented by their own demons. They'd just handled them in different ways. Grace became so obsessed with study, she stayed up late each night cramming for her next exam. Brianna turned to drugs. But now Brianna had the opportunity for a fresh start, and Grace hoped she'd grasp it with both hands, for both their sakes.
"I don't want to do this, Grace."
Tears rolled down Brianna's cheeks. Grace slipped out of her bed and climbed in with Brianna, wrapping her arms around her like she used to. "Give it a chance, baby. You've got nothing to lose." As they lay in each other's arms, Grace tried to erase from her memory the horror of what she'd done. But it was no use. She knew she'd be tormented forever. It was her punishment. A short while later, once they'd woken again and freshened up, Grace and Brianna made their way down the hallway to the kitchen where the children's happy voices could be heard. Grace peeked in before entering. Dylan's little face lit up as he caught sight of her. He hopped out of his chair and ran over to her, hugging her around the middle. "Steady on, Dylan," Lizzie called out from her seat opposite James and Claire. "Give your auntie some space." It's okay, Lizzie. Grace smiled at her as she leaned down and hugged Dylan. Dylan grabbed Brianna's hand and walked between the two of them to the table.
You sit here, Auntie Grace, and you sit here, Auntie.
He glanced at Brianna before looking to his mother. Brianna? Lizzie said. Dylan turned his focus back to Brianna.
Brianna.
Everyone laughed. Dylan's face dropped. Grace gently hugged the little boy. It's okay, Dylan. I call her BB. I'm sure she won't mind if you call her that too.
Auntie BB.
He flashed a charming smile at Brianna. Brianna's lips lifted at the edges into a small smile. Even Brianna couldn't help but warm to this little boy. As Grace and Brianna took their seats on either side of Dylan, Lizzie stood and collected the children's dirty breakfast dishes and carried them to the sink. What can I get you for breakfast? There's cereal and toast, or I can cook eggs, whatever you like. Just toast and tea for me, thanks, Lizzie. Grace replied. She could never stomach breakfast. What she needed was a cigarette and a stiff drink.
Same for me, thanks,
Brianna added quickly. Did you sleep well? I hope the beds were comfy. Lizzie popped 2 pieces of bread into the toaster and turned on the kettle. Grace blew out a breath and smiled. The bed was great, thanks. Took a while to get to sleep, but that's normal. So normal that I haven't had a good night's sleep since before that horrible day. Just as well she'd learned to survive on next to no sleep. The mountain air should fix that pretty quickly. Lizzie flashed her a quick smile as she grabbed the toast. Smoke drifted into the air and the smell of burnt toast reached Grace's nostrils. Just as well I don't do most of the cooking here. Lizzie tossed the burnt pieces into the bin and started again. After breakfast, Mia, the children's nanny, came to take the children outside.
Come and play with us, Auntie Grace and Auntie BB.
Dylan called over his shoulder as Mia led them out the door. Grace laughed. Maybe later, Dylan. Have fun. Once on their own, Lizzie poured herself another cup of tea and sat down, letting out a contented sigh. They're lovely kids, Lizzie. Grace smiled warmly at her. She really meant it. Thank you. Lizzie returned Grace's smile. They can be hard work sometimes, but we love them to bits. She took a sip of her tea and placed her cup on the table. So, Brianna, are you ready to see your new quarters? Brianna's face paled. Grace squeezed her hand. She'll be fine, Lizzie. Grace turned her head and gave Brianna an encouraging smile. Won't you, BB? Brianna's shoulders slumped. Grace drew a slow breath. This was Brianna's last chance to start a new life. She had to take it. She narrowed her eyes at Brianna and pursed her lips. She's ready. Chapter 16. Brianna's heart thudded as she walked between Grace and Lizzie along a gravel pathway leading to the students' quarters in a huge stone mansion. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined she'd be living in a place like this. But would she fit in? She doubted it. It was too nice a place for the likes of her. She was more at home in a gutter or a dingy apartment than a grand place like this. Lizzie directed them towards a side door made of heavy timber. The door stood open, and they followed Lizzie up a spiral staircase. Brianna paused halfway to catch her breath. Are you okay, BB? Grace stopped behind her. Brianna nodded. She held one hand against her chest and took several deep breaths. A pleasant aroma wafted down and tickled her nose. She had expected the mansion to smell like some of the buildings she'd lived in, dank and musty. But this smell was different. It was nice. She drew a deep breath and continued on. At the top of the staircase, a bunch of fresh flowers sat in a beautiful painted vase on a highly polished timber dresser. That's where the smell came from. Brianna's gaze turned to the area to the right of the staircase. A bookcase filled one wall. and an old piano another. But her attention was caught by the 3 oversized couches covered with lap rugs and brightly coloured cushions, and the large coffee table sitting between them. A pile of magazines sat on one corner of the table, and on another corner, a pile of board games. Another smaller bunch of perfumed flowers sat in the middle, making it cosy and inviting. The couches faced a large open fireplace, and Brianna could imagine herself curled up on one of those comfy couches, flicking through a magazine in front of a roaring fire. There was something about this room, and a sense of serenity flowed through her. 3 large religious posters hung on the far wall. She didn't have many thoughts either way about religion, but she hadn't seen much good come out of it. Grace, on the other hand, never hesitated to tell anyone who'd listen that she didn't believe in a God who'd let the mother of 8 young children die an untimely death. If pushed, Brianna tended to agree. "Ah, there you are!" The kindly lady from last night bustled towards them, reminding Brianna a little of that lady at the first place she and Grace stayed at on their trip. But this lady seemed much nicer. Before Brianna could remember her name, the lady held her arms out and drew Brianna to her ample chest. "Ah, Brianna, lassie, so good to see you. I hope you slept well." When she released Brianna, the smile on her face was as warm as her voice.
Yes, thank you.
Brianna's voice quivered, and she struggled to say anything more than that, but she liked the lady, even though she spoke funny. The lady then hugged Grace and Lizzie with just as much warmth as she'd hugged her. "How are you, Rosemary?" Lizzie returned the lady's smile.
Rosemary, that's her name.
"Oh, I'm fine, lassie. How are your wee bairns this morning?" "As active as ever, but they're off with Mia for the day. And what a jolly lassie she is. But come, we need to show Brianna around." Rosemary took Brianna's hand and patted it while she talked. "As you can see, this is the female students' lounge area. There's a television in the corner, but the reception's bad, so it barely gets used. But don't worry, lassie. The girls find they don't miss it. There is plenty of other things to do. This hallway leads to the girls' dormitory." As Rosemary led the way, she continued chatting. "The kitchen, the dining room are downstairs, but the classrooms are further along this hallway. In the front of the building. I'll show them to you later." Stopping in front of a closed door, Rosemary squeezed Brianna's hand. "This is where you'll be staying." Her double chin wobbled. "There is room for 4 girls, but there is only 3 at the moment, including you." Brianna's heart raced. What if they didn't like her? Grace's hand settled on her back, and Brianna relaxed a little. As Rosemary opened the door, Brianna's eyes widened. She'd expected to see double bunk beds, or at least a row of single beds close together, much like they'd grown up with, but instead there were 4 separate areas, each with their own single bed, dresser, and wardrobe. Each bed was covered with a soft, thick duvet, and more pillows than she'd know what to do with. On top of each dresser sat a lamp and more fresh flowers. The room was lovely. Tears flooded Brianna's eyes. She hadn't felt comfortable in Grace's modern apartment, but here, in this warm, friendly room, maybe, just maybe, she might be happy. "This is your bed over here, Brianna." Rosemary directed her to the far area in the left-hand corner. Brianna gasped and gazed out at the mountains that seemed so close she could almost reach out and touch them. She stepped closer to the window. In front of the mountain was a lake with rowboats tied up to a wharf. This was a dream, surely. It couldn't be happening to her. She pinched herself to make sure it was real. Grace stood behind her, placing her arm around Brianna's shoulders. "It's lovely, isn't it, baby?" All Brianna could do was nod as more tears slipped down her cheeks. Rosemary handed her a tissue. There, lassie. It has that effect on all of us." She chuckled. "The other 2 lassies are eager to meet you. They'll be back from morning duties shortly." but let's have a cup of tea and a chat while we wait. I'll leave you to it, Rosemary. Lizzie leaned down and placed a kiss on Rosemary's cheek before turning to Grace, arching an eyebrow towards the door. Come with me? Brianna's eyes shot open. As much as she liked Rosemary, she didn't want to be left alone with her. She held her hand out to Grace and pleaded with her eyes for Grace to stay. Grace held Brianna's gaze for a second, but then tore it away and looked at Lizzie. Yes, I'll come with you. She placed Brianna's bag on the bed and stepped closer to Brianna, brushing the tears off her cheek with her hand. You'll be fine, BB. I'll be back soon. She squeezed her hand and then turned and left with Lizzie. Brianna crumpled. How could Grace just leave her like that? Tears stung her eyes again, and her bottom lip quivered. Rosemary closed the gap between them, drawing Brianna into a hug and smoothing Brianna's hair with her hand. You'll be fine, lassie. The first day is always the hardest. Her voice was soft and kind. Rosemary pulled a white, scented handkerchief out of her pocket and gave it to Brianna. Brianna sniffed, then blew her nose. She drew a steadying breath and lifted her head slowly to meet Rosemary's kind gaze. She managed a small, tentative smile.
Thank you.
Her voice was no more than a whisper. You're more than welcome, lassie. Come now. Leave your unpacking till later. Let's go and have that cup of tea. Rosemary guided Brianna into another room at the far end of the hallway, passing 2 more rooms along the way that Rosemary told her were the other girls' rooms. We have beds for 12 girls altogether, and this is my office. Brianna followed her into a room that looked more like a sitting room than an office. A small desk sat in one corner, but 2 comfy-looking couches, positioned at right angles and both with a view of distant mountains, grabbed Brianna's attention. Take a seat, Brianna, I'll put the kettle on. Rosemary opened a cupboard and pulled out a kettle, 2 large mugs and a teapot. She placed 3 heaped teaspoons of tea leaves into the pot before joining Brianna on the opposite couch. So, what do you know about the place, Brianna? Rosemary gave her an easy smile as she perched on the edge of her couch. Brianna shrugged.
Not much.
Rosemary chuckled. Well, you're in for a treat. Her face expanded into a beaming grin. There are so many things to do here. It's a wonderful place to learn new skills. Most of the girls love the cooking lessons, and some prefer gardening to piano, but there are so many options, and you can try them all to start with and see what you prefer. The kettle whistled, and Rosemary bounced up and turned it off. She poured the steaming water into the teapot and then placed a colourful tea cosy over it, just like Mam used to do. The sudden memory brought tears to Brianna's eyes. She rarely thought of Mam, but when she did, she always grew sad. She missed Mam so much. Why did she have to die? She brushed her tears away quickly with the handkerchief before Rosemary could see them. Rosemary poured 2 mugs of tea, placing them, along with a jug of milk and a sugar pot, on a small table between them. As she looked up, her expression changed. She sat beside Brianna, placing her arm around her shoulder. What's wrong, lassie? Her voice was gentle and soft. Tears returned to Brianna's eyes. She clenched her hands and tried to squeeze them back. She wasn't a crybaby. What was she doing? She sucked in a breath and gulped.
It's nothing.
Ah, lassie, if you don't want to talk, that's fine, but something's unsettling you. I can see it in your wee bonny face. Rosemary spoke in a gentle voice, with a lilting Scottish burr, and as she brushed Brianna's face lightly with her warm fingertips, tears streamed down Brianna's face. Sniffing, Brianna lowered her eyes and balled the handkerchief in her hands.
Mom had a teapot and cozy just like yours.
How old were you when she died? Brianna sniffed again.
10.
Rosemary pulled her close and rocked her. Poor wee lassie. Her voice was soothing, like the sound of a dove cooing to its young. There's no need to talk about it now, lassie, but when you're ready, I'm a good listener. Brianna was tempted, but she wasn't ready. Straightening, she blew her nose and slowly lifted her eyes to Rosemary's.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sweetheart. Would you like some shortbread? Handmade by the girls, and it's very good. Rosemary held the plate out to her. Brianna took a piece and nibbled it. Rosemary was right, it was really good. Do you like cooking, Brianna? Brianna blinked.
I've not done any, so I don't know.
Would you like to learn? Brianna blinked again.
I've never thought about it, but maybe.
Rosemary smiled as she took a bite of shortbread and settled back further on the couch, balancing her cup and saucer with one hand. I think you'll like it here, Brianna. It's a place where hurts from the past can be slowly healed. Daniel will give you a full rundown on the program this afternoon with the other new students. She glanced towards the door as two girls stopped in the doorway. One was thin and had shoulder-length brown hair and very narrow arched eyebrows. The other girl had dark hair and pale skin, and a heart tattooed on her neck. Rosemary's face expanded into a beaming smile as she extended her hand to the two girls. Come in, lassies, and meet your new roommate. The two girls stepped into the room. Rosemary put her teacup down and patted spots on either side of her on the couch. As the girls sat, Rosemary placed her arm around the thin girl on her left. Brianna, this is Maggie. Maggie comes from London and has been with us for just under a week. Maggie gave Brianna a half-smile and fiddled nervously with her hands. Rosemary then placed her arm around the other girl, the dark-haired girl with the tattoo. And this is Susan. She comes from Glasgow. She's been here just under a week as well. Hiya. Susan sounded just like Rosemary, and her smile was warmer than Maggie's.
Hi.
Brianna gave a small smile before lowering her eyes. I've been telling Brianna a little about the place, and she's seen your room, but hasn't unpacked yet. She patted both their legs. Why don't we head back there and I can leave you girls to help Brianna settle in before you meet with Daniel? Rosemary smiled at them both, her double chin wobbling as she turned her head. The two girls agreed and they stood, waiting for Brianna to do the same. Brianna swallowed hard. She was just getting used to being with Rosemary, and now she was expected to spend time with girls she didn't know. She wasn't ready for this, but seemed she had no choice. Where are you from, Brianna? Susan asked in her Scottish burr as they walked along the hallway together.
Belfast.
It was all Brianna could manage. You're going to love it here. It's such a cool place, and the people are great. Wait. Susan turned and placed her hand on Brianna's shoulder. Daniel's your brother, isn't he? Brianna's shoulders slumped. She didn't want to be known as the manager's sister, but it seemed everyone already knew. She sighed. What did it matter?
Yes, but I hardly know him. Last time I saw him, I was 10.
Really? Wow! They reached the room before Susan could say more. Rosemary glanced at her watch as she stopped in front of them. Okay, girls, you've got half an hour before you need to meet Daniel down in the meeting room. Turning to Brianna, Rosemary rubbed her arm. Are you okay, lassie? Her eyes were soft and warm as she met Brianna's gaze. Brianna sucked in a breath. Was she okay? She didn't really know. But surprisingly, in the few short moments she'd spent with Susan and Maggie, something had clicked with Susan in particular, and for the first time in a long time, Brianna thought she might end up having a friend. She nodded, giving Rosemary the biggest smile she'd given anyone in a long time.
I think so.
That's grand, lassie. She pulled Brianna in for another hug before releasing her. I'll see you there soon. Have fun. She turned and bustled down the hallway, leaving the girls alone with each other for the first time. Chapter 17. For the next half hour, Susan and Maggie helped Brianna unpack and set up her area of the room. Brianna discovered that Susan had been trying to kick her drug habit for the last 2 years without success, and it was her mother who'd heard about the Elim community and arranged for her to come. She'd been clean for 3 weeks, and was eager to be clean for the rest of her life. Maggie's problem was different. She'd been brought up in foster care all her life, and didn't seem to fit anywhere. A care worker from the local parish recommended the Elim community to her. Brianna found herself opening up with the girls. She told them she'd been on drugs since she was 16, and that it was her sister who'd brought her here in hope of getting her clean. She didn't tell them about being raped or losing her baby. Some secrets were just too deep. "It's time to go," Susan said as she glanced at the clock beside the door. "We can help you finish later, Brianna." The girls headed along the hallway and down another spiral staircase similar to the one Brianna had gone up earlier. Brianna had no idea where they were after that. The building was full of narrow hallways that twisted and turned and went up and down. But finally they arrived in a room that looked much like a classroom, except that the chairs were placed in a semicircle and not straight rows. Daniel looked up as the girls entered. Brianna hung back, but Susan grabbed her hand and pulled her in. Brianna's heart raced again. What was she doing here? This was crazy. Brianna O'Connor in a classroom, with Daniel, her brother, as teacher? She shook her head and blinked. She must be dreaming. But no, Daniel strode over to her, and taking one of her hands, kissed her on the cheek. His face grew warm. Why would he embarrass her in front of everyone like that? He smiled easily and his eyes sparkled. "Brianna, good to see you." She felt like hiding. He then turned to Susan and Maggie. "And good to see you both." He gave them a warm smile, but didn't hug or kiss them. "The boys are on their way, but in the meantime, take a seat." Just as they were sitting, 2 young men entered. Brianna's eyes popped.
"Braden McCafferty? What's he doing here?"
The boy all the girls crushed on in school. The boy everyone expected to go places, to be someone. She peered at him.
"Yes, it's him. But he's different."
His eyes were dull and lifeless, and his head hung low. But she would have known him anywhere. Every night in that horrid room Aunt Hilda had called their bedroom, she'd dreamed about him as she and Grace huddled together to keep warm. But now he was in front of her. All she wanted to do was hide. "Boys, come on in." Daniel waved Braden and the other young man in and clapped both of them on the back. As Daniel introduced everyone, Brianna's heart pounded. What if Braden recognized her? What would happen then? But there was no recognition in his face. Braden didn't remember her. Brianna breathed a sigh of relief. Grace had said that their brother had a way with people. Brianna wasn't sure what Grace had meant by that until now. But when Daniel stood in front of the room, all eyes were on him, even Braden's. He cleared his throat. "Well, good morning, everyone." His eyes and voice were bright. "Most of you have been here for a few days already, and I hope you've started to settle in. But now you're all here, it's time to kick off properly. Welcome to Elim Community, a place of hope and new beginnings." He paused and caught each student's eye as his gaze travelled around the room. "We've all messed up, you and me both. I've been where you are today, and okay, I'm not perfect by a long shot. Just ask my wife. But I can assure you that my life now is so much better than it was just a few years ago. What we have here in this community is a place where you won't be judged. You'll be offered hope, love and understanding, and you'll have the opportunity to learn new skills that'll help you live a more fulfilling life than you've ever dreamed possible." Daniel took a mouthful of water and, pulling his chair closer to everyone, leaned forward. As Brianna listened to Daniel, She caught a little of his infectious enthusiasm. Her heart quickened. Maybe, just maybe, this place might hold the answers to the questions she didn't even know she was asking. Daniel angled his head. What makes us different from other places you might have been to? For a start, you're living in a beautiful mansion in the Scottish Highlands. That has to be different, he chuckled. But apart from that, being away from the city and your normal environment helps give a different perspective on life. How many of you have ever sat on top of a mountain you've spent all morning climbing and gazed out into the distance in awe? He waited, but no one claimed they had. In fact, they all shook their heads. How many of you have rowed along a loch in the early morning when the water is still so glassy you can't tell where the loch ends and the mountains begin? They all shook their heads again. And how many of you have had someone you can talk to who will listen without judging or trying to tell you what to do? His voice had an infinitely compassionate tone, and all eyes were fixed on him. You've all come here because you've tried other places or programs, but nothing so far has worked. You're still struggling with your demons, whatever they are, and you've come here, possibly as a last resort. He smiled. We don't offer any guarantees, but we know that if you're committed to turning your life around, it's more than possible to do that here. We're a Christian community, but we don't force religion down your throat. We expect you to go to classes where you'll have the chance to find out what Christianity is all about, but then it's up to you to make the decision. You won't be judged either way. You'll also meet with either David or Rosemary at least once a day to chat about how you're doing. They're great people, and you'll find them both easy to talk to. He took a sip of water. Our program also includes outdoor and indoor activities such as hiking, rowing, abseiling, sailing, metalwork, carpentry, gardening, cooking, piano lessons, painting. Basically, whatever you want to learn, you can learn here. We also expect students to work for several hours a day to help cover their board. Apart from daily chores, we have several small businesses running, and you'll be assigned on a roster basis to help out with each of them in turn. Daniel paused, letting his gaze travel around the students again. So you'll be kept busy, but what you get out of this place will depend on how much effort you put in. I have great hopes for all of you. He smiled at them before glancing towards the door. And now, here are David, Rosemary, Ryan and Emily. Let me introduce each of them properly. The 4 staff members briefly spoke as Daniel introduced them one at a time. When Rosemary stood and smiled at Brianna, warmth trickled through Brianna's body. Okay then, Daniel said once the staff members had finished. Lunch and then you get to choose an activity. Ryan's running a beginner abseiling class and Emily's holding a cooking class. Shepherd's pie on the menu, and I believe we'll be eating that for dinner. Emily nodded. And then after that, you'll have some free time. And after dinner, we'll have our first class. Sound good? Daniel glanced around the group as he stood. Everyone nodded apart from Brayden. What are you going to choose, Brianna? Susan asked as they walked to the dining room together. That was a good question, but since she had no idea what abseiling was, there really wasn't an option.
Cooking.
Susan smiled broadly and linked her arm through Brianna's. Me too. Maggie walked ahead with Rosemary, and Brianna felt a pang of jealousy run through her. The afternoon passed, and Brianna enjoyed her first cooking class ever. Emily was a patient teacher, and Brianna was proud of the pie she'd made. She hoped everyone would like it. During her spare time, she finished unpacking and settled into her room. Later, sitting in the classroom and hearing Daniel talk about God and Jesus, it was like a switch flicked in her mind. Daniel said to forget all they'd heard and been taught about religion. Jesus had come to offer peace, hope and forgiveness, and all the fighting over religion just showed how many people had missed the true message. Over the coming weeks, they'd be studying the Gospel of John, but any questions they had along the way would also be addressed. They all left with their very own copy of the New Testament. Brianna glanced at Braden as the students shared supper after class. The other boys chatted together, but he barely said a word.
What happened to you, Braden McCafferty?
Meanwhile, Grace spent the morning with Lizzie and helped with her jobs, all the while keeping a lookout for Ryan. Her pulse quickened when she caught a glimpse of him just before lunch as he jumped out of his truck and sprinted into what Lizzie told her was the meeting room. "I saw you looking at him, Grace." Lizzie's face twisted in an amused grin, and her eyes sparkled. "No, I wasn't." Grace turned quickly and composed herself. "I hope you do better than that in court," Lizzie chuckled. "Still no one special in your life?" Grace shook her head slowly. "There never will be." "He's a nice man. You should get to know him." Letting out a sigh, Grace's shoulders slumped. But Ryan had been a soldier and had probably killed 100 times more people than she had. Maybe she could risk it. She drew a breath. "We'll see." Chapter 18. One morning, several days later, Grace was sitting outside in the garden wrapped in a blanket, trying to read a John Grisham thriller she'd found amongst all the Christian books on Lizzie's bookshelf, but she was finding it hard to relax, and was wishing she was back in the courtroom. A movement distracted her, and looking up, Grace saw Brianna coming towards her with a smile on her face. Putting her book down, Grace held out her hand. "Hey, BB, this is a nice surprise. How are you?" Pulling Brianna onto the seat beside her, she gave Brianna a big hug.
Good. Really good.
Brianna's eyes were brighter than Grace had ever seen them. Even her voice sounded more alive. Grace smiled into Brianna's eyes as she brushed some hair off Brianna's forehead. "That's great. What have you been doing?" Brianna let out a small chuckle.
"I've been learning how to cook."
Her eyes sparkled as she held out a covered plate.
"I made an apple pie this morning, and I brought you some."
The proud smile on Brianna's face brought tears to Grace's eyes. Was this the same girl she had left in Daniel's care just 3 days ago? "It smells wonderful." Grace lifted the cloth and took a peek. Brianna smiled, her eyes glistening.
"I've done some painting too, and I've been canoeing on the loch. I didn't even fall in."
Shaking her head, Grace laughed. "I don't believe it."
"Here's something you really won't believe."
Brianna's expression grew serious, and she glanced down at her hands before meeting Grace's gaze.
"I've been taking the Bible classes Daniel runs, and he's amazing. You should hear him."
Grace stiffened. "Don't tell me they've brainwashed you already."
"No, Grace, it's not like that. Really, there is no pressure. We're allowed to make our own minds up, but I'm starting to understand about God and how he can fix my life if I let him. I've still got a lot to learn, but so far it makes sense."
"Well, it's great to see you so excited." Grace smiled at her, but let out a sigh. At least she's off the drugs, for now. "You know I don't believe in all that, but if you want to, that's up to you." Brianna grabbed Grace's hand.
"You should come to one of Danny's classes and see for yourself."
Grace pursed her lips. "I don't think so, but thanks."
"Tomorrow, Ryan's taking us hiking, and he said to ask if you wanted to come."
Grace's eyes widened. He hadn't forgotten. "Who's going?"
"All the new students. There's 5 of us, 3 girls and 2 boys. Oh, I forgot to tell you. One of the boys was in my class at school, but he doesn't remember me."
Brianna's smile slipped.
"He's not doing too well."
"But you are, BB, and that's all that matters." Grace squeezed her hand. Sighing, Brianna glanced down at her hands.
"Yes, I know. But everyone else is doing well, apart from him."
She looked up, her face brightening.
"Danny's coming too."
Grace ran her hand through her hair. I'll think about it. But she'd already made up her mind. She'd go.
We're leaving at 9 if you decide to come.
Leaning forward, Brianna gave Grace a hug.
Thanks for bringing me here, Grace.
Tears stung her eyes. Was it possible that Bebe was finally getting clean? Straightening, Grace smiled into Brianna's eyes and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I'm glad you're happy here, Bebe. I really am. Brianna nodded and gulped.
See you in the morning?
Maybe. A spark of hope grew inside Grace as Brianna walked away with a spring in her step. It had only been a few days, but already Brianna was a changed person. But would it last? Lizzie poked her head out the kitchen door. Lunch is ready, Grace. Coming. Grace folded the blanket, picked up her book and headed inside. The children were already seated at the table, as noisy as ever.
Come and sit here, Auntie Grace.
Dylan jumped up and grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the seat next to him. Grace laughed as she let Dylan drag her along. How could she resist his charm? He was just like his father. Have you had a good morning? Grace asked as she sat beside him.
Yes, we've played lots of games and we did some painting. I did this one for you.
He jumped off his seat again and scrambled through a box of bits and pieces, finally pulling out a folded piece of paper which he handed to her. Carefully opening it, Grace swallowed hard. Dylan had painted himself holding her hand. It's lovely, Dylan. Thank you. She swallowed again as she gave him a big smile. I'll take it home with me and put it on my wall.
Really?
His whole face lit up. Grace nodded. It might not fit her decor, but it would take pride of place in her living room. That's enough now, Dylan. Lizzie placed a tray of sandwiches cut into triangles on the table. He's fine, Lizzie. Let him be. Grace chuckled as she folded the painting and slipped it into her book.
We did some too.
Little Claire spoke timidly, her big round eyes serious as she looked at Grace. Did you? You'll have to show me. Claire nodded as she stuck her thumb in her mouth. Lizzie joined them at the table and, reaching out her hands, took hold of the boys' hands. Let's give thanks before we eat. Having been there 3 days already, Grace was used to this, so she took Dylan's other hand and gently plied Claire's thumb from her mouth and bowed her head while Lizzie gave thanks. It was a pointless routine, but she had no choice. Lizzie raised her head and began placing sandwiches on the children's plates. Please help yourself, Grace. Thanks. Grace smiled and reached for a ham and tomato sandwich. Was that Brianna I saw leaving a while ago? Lizzie looked up. Grace nodded. Yes, she seems to be doing really well. Daniel said she was doing great. You must be so relieved. Grace released a slow breath. I just hope it lasts. I know what you mean. I used to get my hopes up with Daniel all the time. Lizzie let out a heavy sigh before brightening. But he got there in the end, and so will Brianna. I hope so. Grace toyed with her napkin. If anyone knew what she was going through, Lizzie did. Hers and Daniel's marriage had almost fallen apart because of his addiction to alcohol. She asked if I wanted to go hiking with them tomorrow. Lizzie's eyes widened. You should go, Grace. You'll love it. I was thinking I might. Some exercise might do me good. Cup of tea? Lizzie held up a teapot and raised a brow, an amused smirk sitting on her face. Grace ignored the smirk. Yes, please. That would be lovely. Later that evening, when Grace was preparing her hiking clothes for the morning, she came across the letter Niall had given her before she left Belfast. Sitting on the wing chair under the window, she toyed with the letter. She knew the contents by heart, but opened it anyway. She shouldn't have, because her thoughts were drawn back to the night he'd proposed. She was 24 when they both graduated from law school, and to celebrate, Niall had booked a table at the fanciest restaurant in Belfast, on top of the Riverside Tower. Grace would have been happy just to go to the local pub, but he'd insisted. He was paying, so she agreed. He looked so handsome that night, but he always did. He had such style, and that evening, in his freshly pressed navy trousers and crisp white shirt, Grace was acutely aware she was with the most eligible bachelor in town. Her heart skipped a beat when he placed his hand on the small of her back and led her into the elegant dining room. As the waiter directed them to a window seat, Grace's gaze was automatically drawn in the direction of Londonderry, almost 100 miles away. Would there come a time when she didn't think about the events of that afternoon and evening? She doubted it, but Niall would never know. No one would. Spectacular, isn't it? Grace blinked. She had to focus on Niall and on the present, and not on events of the past. Turning towards him, she planted a smile on her face and nodded. Yes, it is. All through dinner they chatted easily, talking about life after university and the jobs they were going to. Niall was going to work in his father's practice, defending the innocent. She'd be working for the Department of Public Prosecution, prosecuting the guilty. It was highly likely they'd cross each other in court some day in the future. They laughed when they discussed who'd been most likely to win. After dinner, Niall took her hand, squeezing it and looking deeply into her eyes. A quick and disturbing thought flashed through her mind as he reached into his pocket, drawing out a small red box and placing it on the table between them. She gulped. Grace, you know how much I love you. Niall's voice, strong and deep, sent a quiver of excitement through her, but she couldn't go there. She steeled herself as he continued, rubbing his thumb gently along her hand. You won't agree to live with me, so I'm hoping instead that you'll agree to marry me. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, and his eyes, filled with hope, remained locked on hers. Her stomach churned. He squeezed her hand tighter. Grace, will you marry me? Tears slipped down Grace's cheek as a deep ache grew in her heart. Niall was the perfect man, and she loved him, but she could never be his wife. She had to live with her past, but she couldn't expect anyone else to. Looking at him now, she wished she'd never gotten involved with him. She could never commit to a permanent relationship with him or anyone. Sniffing, Grace wiped her tears with a napkin and lowered her gaze. She was about to break his heart, and there was nothing she could do. If only things had been different. Taking a slow breath, Grace looked up and met his quizzical gaze. Niall, she gulped. I can't marry you. I'm so sorry. Not now, not ever. She swallowed hard. If only she could have said yes. Niall's face paled. He leaned closer, gripping her hand. Grace, why not? Please tell me. We can work through whatever the problem is. Please don't do this. His voice was shaky, pleading, distraught. Grace shook her head and fought back her tears. No, Niall, we can't. Images of bloodied bodies strewn on the pavement flashed through her mind. There was no way they could work through that together. Grace, please tell me. He gripped her hand. She couldn't bear the pain in his eyes, but there was nothing she could do. Nothing. The suffocating sensation of loss gnawed at her, overwhelming her. This was the end for them. She had to make a clean break. She couldn't allow him any hope. She squeezed his hand and forced her tears back. Niall, I can't marry you. Not now, not ever. I'm sorry. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pushed her chair back and stood. I've got to go. I'm sorry. She could barely speak. She fled towards the elevator, and when she got home, she drank a whole bottle of gin and cried herself to sleep. Sitting in the chair under the window in Lizzie's cottage, tears streamed down Grace's cheeks. She'd tried to bury the pain and despair of that night in her work, but nothing had changed. Niall coming back into her life had proven that. She still loved him, but she couldn't marry him or anyone else. Those innocent people's lives were on her head, and would be until the day she died. Sleep eluded Grace as usual. Memories circled in her head like vultures, each eager to take a piece of her. But that was nothing new, and so the following morning she was ready to leave by 8:30. Grace shivered as she walked the short distance along the path that joined the cottage and the mansion. Mist hung in the air like a damp blanket. Why had she agreed to go? Right now, a courtroom held way more appeal. As Grace rounded the corner and approached the main entrance, her breath caught. Ryan was leaning against the centre's minibus, his arms folded and one ankle crossed over the other as he chatted with Danny. He was a good-looking man, and her heart quickened, not only at his ease and self-confidence, but also at the muscles bulging under his ribbed khaki sweatshirt. Since Niall, she'd only had casual liaisons, and the thought of a casual dalliance with Ryan appealed. It wouldn't have to be serious, just a short fling, and it might help rid her of Niall's lingering memory. Ryan lifted his gaze as Grace approached, his eyes sweeping over her face approvingly. "You decided to come?" "Yes." She tilted her chin, but her heart pounded. "It's a great day for a hike." An easy smile played at the corners of his mouth. "You could have picked a better one." Grace glanced at the mist hanging over the mountains. "It had better not rain." "A bit of rain never hurt anyone," he chuckled, his eyes twinkling. Grace raised a brow. "Ryan's right, Grace. You get used to it." Leaning forward, Danny placed a kiss on her cheek. "We'll see." Ryan winked at her as he began loading the students' backpacks into the bus. Shortly after, sitting in the middle beside Brianna, surrounded by Brianna's new friends, Grace felt like a fish out of water, but she fixed her eyes on the broad shoulders and the curly reddish-blonde head of hair in front of her. As Ryan drove skillfully along the single track winding its way above the eastern shores of Loch Lynn, the mist began to lift, and Grace glanced out the window at the rugged, bare hills dotted with sheep and the occasional herd of Highland cattle. She had to admit, it was kind of beautiful in its own way. Ryan stopped the bus on a heather-covered meadow on the crest of a hill, and everyone piled out. Ryan and Daniel handed out the packs, and when Grace took hers from Ryan, her fingers brushed his. Lifting her gaze, she angled her head and looked into his blue eyes, once again wondering what a man like him was doing in a place like this. They set off in single file, Ryan in the lead and Daniel at the tail. Grace chose to walk with Daniel. She'd make her move later when it was more appropriate. And besides, from the back, she could keep her eye on Ryan. The winding path led across the bare foothills dotted with rocks, heather and sheep. Below, to the right, the loch reflected the grey of the sky, and the remains of an old castle sat on the far side, bearing witness to times gone by. Up ahead, Brianna chatted with her new friends. Grace knew she should be happy for her, and she was, but it only highlighted her own unhappiness. Brianna might be able to shake off the shackles of the past in religion, but Grace could never do that. She needed to return to work, immerse herself in it. That was the only way she could survive, by prosecuting scum, because in some cathartic way, every case she took, she was prosecuting herself. "You've gone very quiet, Grace. What's up?" Daniel asked from behind. She shrugged. Nothing. Just enjoying the view. Chapter 19. After hiking for an hour, Ryan stopped on a grassy knoll, removing his backpack and turned around, pleased to see that everyone had kept up, even Grace. He looked at her with a heavy heart. She needed the freeing power of Jesus' love in her life as much as these drug-addicted kids did. She just didn't know it. It didn't matter that she was a wealthy barrister, or gave the appearance of someone who had it all together. He'd seen through her facade the moment he'd laid eyes on her. Maybe it was his training, but he had a gift of knowing what made people tick, and Grace O'Connor had a ticking time bomb inside her. He sent up a quick prayer for her. Braden stopped behind him. Ryan smiled at the troubled young man. Keep up okay? Braden's face was still deathly pale and disengaged, but it was early days. Ryan was sure that the enthusiasm of the others would rub off on him in time, and that the Holy Spirit would touch the young man's heart, softening it, drawing him slowly but surely to the healer of broken lives. Every night the staff prayed for the students and the guests, like Grace. In the 2 years he'd been with the Elim community, Ryan had witnessed miracle after miracle as God's healing touch changed the lives of those who came. Something wonderful happened when the troubled youth distanced themselves from the hustle and bustle of city life and came face to face with the raw beauty of God's creation. He expected the same would happen for both Braden and Grace, just like it already had for Brianna. Braden shrugged, barely giving a grunt. Squeezing the young man's shoulder, Ryan gave him an encouraging smile. He was going to be hard work, but God was able to break through his barriers. It might just take time. Everyone else stopped and took out a snack, oatcakes made by the students and water. Ryan had several flasks of coffee and, after offering some to the students, held out a mug to Grace. Like some? Thought you'd never ask. She let out a small chuckle as she took the mug. Throwing her pack onto the ground, she lowered herself gracefully onto a rock, stretching her long, slender legs in front of her, and took a sip. Mind if I join you? She looked up, her hazel eyes travelling lazily up his body. Please do. He ignored her play acting and sat on the ground beside her. So, Grace O'Connor, what do you think of the Highlands so far? Tilting her head, she met his gaze and took her time in answering. They have their good points. He chuckled. They certainly do. He held out a container full of oatcakes. Like one? She shook her head. No thanks. Come on, Grace, you're not watching your weight, are you? And besides, your sister made them. Grace grunted, and reaching out, picked one of the cookies. I don't normally snack. Too busy, huh? Grace shrugged. Something like that. Well, if you stay out here long enough, you'll not only develop a good appetite, but you'll feel better. Maybe you need to slow down a little. I'm perfectly fine, thank you. He studied her before speaking. She was a beautiful woman, there was no doubt about it. Her rich auburn hair lay thick on her shoulders, and although her profile was strong and determined, underneath that facade lay a soft heart. Of that he was sure, otherwise, why would she have brought her sister here? Are you really fine, Grace? She took another sip of her coffee and lifted her chin. Yes. Her eyes flickered as she dug her heel into the ground. He gave her a warm smile. If ever you want to talk, I'm a good listener. Grace angled her head. And what about you, Ryan McGregor? Are you fine? What are you really doing here? She raised her brow, an amused look on her face. Hiding from something or someone? Ryan laughed. I can see why you're good in the courtroom. He held her gaze as his expression sobered. I'm here because I want to be. He drew a breath and released it slowly. I love these kids, and I want to help them. Her gaze didn't waver. She was assessing him just as she'd assess a witness in one of her high-profile cases. He had nothing to hide. Not any longer, anyway. His past was just that. His past. God had cleansed him and forgiven him. Praise the Lord. Grace's eyes narrowed. That's a very glib answer. It may be, but it's true. I love it here. It's peaceful and it's rewarding, and I'm not hiding from anyone or anything. Everyone has something in their past, Ryan, including you. Perhaps, but when you have God in your life, He gives you a clean start, and your past can be left where it belongs, in the past. She went silent. Something had happened to Grace, and it still haunted her. He'd say an extra prayer for her tonight. Well, it's time we made a move. He jumped up and held his hand out. The touch of her skin triggered an unexpected response, one he hadn't felt for a long time. Her hand remained in his a moment longer than necessary. She was still flirting with him, but this time he looked at her with fresh eyes. He could easily fall for her, but not until God did a work in her heart. Grace walked beside Ryan until they stopped for lunch. She was tempted to quiz him, to ply him with questions about his past, but refrained. Instead, she quizzed him about the Highlands and about the countryside they were walking through. Anything that wasn't personal or about God. We're all going to the Highland Games on Saturday. Will you still be here then? Ryan asked as they walked along the grassy trail with plenty of room for two high above Loch Lynn. The mist had lifted completely, and the loch shimmered in the bright sunshine. I was thinking I'd go home since Brianna seems settled. Why don't you stay, Grace? At least until after the weekend. You can't come to Scotland and not go to a Highland Games. That's what Lizzie said. Grace shrugged. I'll give it some thought. You'd enjoy it. It's a really fun day, and there's a ceilidh in the evening. You can't miss that. I can't dance, Ryan. She chuckled at the very thought of doing a Highland fling. I can teach you. Grace turned and looked at him. If things were different, she could easily fall for this man. His easy, relaxed manner was so refreshing, but nothing had changed in her life, and all she could offer him would be a few fun times together, and then she'd have to walk away. But maybe she could go to the ceilidh with him. And then afterwards, who knew what might eventuate? You're very convincing. Okay, I'll stay. His face broke into a wide, open smile, lighting up his eyes that were as blue as the loch below them. When Grace returned to the cottage later that afternoon, Lizzie and the children were sitting on a blanket out on the grass having a picnic. Lizzie waved her over. Come and join us, Grace. Dylan's face lit up. He jumped up and ran towards Grace, throwing his arms around her waist.
I missed you, Auntie Grace.
Grace couldn't help herself, and a laugh bubbled up from deep within. Dylan's infectious enthusiasm warmed her heart. It really was nice being wanted, even if it was only by a child. And I missed you too, Dylan. She bent down and gave him a hug before he grabbed her hand and led her to the rug.
Sit down, Auntie Grace, and have a gingerbread man. I helped Mummy make them.
Grace caught Lizzie's amused look and grinned. They look lovely, Dylan, but I don't know if I could fit one in. The expression on his little face fell. Grace let out a breath. She'd said the wrong thing. On second thought, I'd love one. His smile returned, and he quickly picked a gingerbread man out of the container and held it out to her. Put it on a plate for Auntie Grace, Dylan, Lizzie said in a stern voice. He giggled. Sorry. He picked up a small plate and after placing the gingerbread man on it, handed it to Grace with a sparkle in his eye. "Thank you, Dylan. It looks great." Grace took a bite just to be polite, but it actually tasted so good she took a bigger bite. Maybe Ryan was right, and the Highland air had given her an appetite. "So how was the hike?" Lizzie leaned back, resting her hands on the ground behind her. "It was actually much easier than I thought it would be, but I think I could do with a rest. I'm not used to all this physical activity." Lizzie gave her a warm smile. "Plenty of time before dinner. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you. There was a phone call for you. I wrote the number down inside." Grace's face fell. It couldn't be Caleb, because Lizzie would have said so. It had to be Niall. She finished her gingerbread man and managed to ease Claire off her lap. For some reason, the little girl had taken a liking to her and took whatever opportunity she could to sit on her lap. Grace thought it was cute. In fact, everything about Claire was cute, from her big round eyes and adorable blonde hair cut in a bob, to the thumb that perpetually lived in her mouth. "Auntie Grace has got to go, Claire. I'm sorry. I'll see you at dinner, okay?" The little girl nodded. Grace walked into the cottage and found the note Lizzie had taken. Yes, it was Niall's number. She glanced at her watch. He'd called more than 3 hours ago. Strange he'd be calling on a workday. Something must have happened. Perhaps to his father. Why else would he be ringing? Nothing had changed between them, and he knew that. She dialed the number, and he answered within 2 rings. Chapter 20. "Grace, thanks for calling back." Niall's voice sounded so familiar, so calm, so steady. "I only rang because I thought something must have happened to your father." "No, nothing like that. Sorry to have caused you worry. I was just ringing to let you know that O'Malley's appeal has been scheduled for next week. I know you said you wouldn't be back for it, but I just thought I should let you know in case you changed your mind." Grace held the receiver tighter against her ear. Her heart rate increased. The pull of the courtroom was strong, and hadn't she been thinking about returning anyway? It was tempting, very tempting. She let out a slow breath. "I'll think about it, Niall. Thanks for letting me know." She paused, her eyebrows furrowing. Would we be against each other again? How would she ever convince him they had no future together if they kept seeing each other? "Yes, come back. Grace, I've missed you." His voice had lost its calmness and had grown thick and unsteady. Grace slumped against the wall and held her hand against her head. There it was, the real reason. She exhaled slowly. "Nothing's changed, Niall." He didn't reply. Most likely he'd be sitting at his desk holding a photo of her. If only he'd let go of her. She wasn't any good for him, and he deserved better. Way better. He was a good man, a lovely man, a caring man. Grace closed her eyes as the acute sense of loss overwhelmed her again. Maybe she could live with him and keep her secret hidden. No, he'd find out somehow. He was a barrister, and he'd whittle it out of her eventually. She couldn't drag him down with her if ever she was discovered. She had to stay strong, keep her walls up. Even going back for the appeal would be asking for trouble. But then, she'd have to go back sometime. She'd just have to learn to live in the same city as him without allowing him back into her life. Difficult, when they'd meet in court every other day. "How's your father?" She had to say something. "Doing okay. How's Brianna?" "Good." She swallowed hard. Silence. "I'll think about the appeal. I need to go." "I love you, Grace." His words came out quickly. "Niall, don't." Tears pricked her eyes, and she could barely speak. "I have to go." She hung up and made her way to her bedroom. Falling onto her bed, she sobbed into the pillow until she fell asleep. Sometime later, Grace woke to a soft knocking on her door. Her head felt thick like concrete, heavy and lifeless. "Dinner's ready, Grace." Lizzie's voice came to her through her fog. Grace struggled to lift her head. There was no way she could drag herself to the table. "I'll be down later, Lizzie." Her voice belonged to someone else. Not to Grace O'Connor, barrister. "Are you all right?" Lizzie's voice held concern. Grace forced herself to reply. "Just tired." "Okay, I'll keep your dinner warm." Rolling onto her back, Grace lifted her hand to her forehead and stared at the ceiling. What did she have to live for? Brianna no longer needed her. Now she had Danny and religion. She couldn't marry Niall. She could never have children. Not that she wanted any. Hadn't even thought about it until being with Lizzie and Danny's kids. But maybe if things had been different, all she had was work, which meant she needed to go back. Only work would provide the answer to her deep despair and loneliness, but then she'd have to see Niall. She had no choice. She'd just have to learn to ignore him. She'd have that fling with Ryan McGregor and then go back. The next couple of days passed. Grace put up her walls and pretended everything was fine. She was good at that. She even feigned joy when Brianna told her she'd given her heart to Jesus. Grace hugged her and wished her well, but she didn't know this new Brianna. In some ways, she was more comfortable with the old Brianna. At least she understood her then. But now, it was like Brianna's past had never existed. Grace doubted it would last. It had happened too quickly. How could Brianna forget about being raped and the death of her baby just like that? Grace guessed she hadn't told anyone about either, and it would only be a matter of time before she was back on drugs. But then, she'd be Danny and Lizzie's problem, not hers. Grace had told everybody she'd be leaving on Monday to attend the appeal. She had no doubt the guilty judgment would be upheld, but it was an excuse to leave. She was tempted to go earlier, but everyone insisted she go to the games on Saturday. Besides, spending the day with Ryan still held attraction. She might get to have that fling with him yet. The morning of the games, Grace went with Danny, Lizzie and the children. Ryan said he'd meet her there, as he was transporting the students in the minibus. The light misty rain, which Danny told her was called smear, didn't seem to worry the crowd already filling the football field. As Grace stepped out of the van, Dylan took her hand.
"Can you take me to the rides, Auntie Grace?"
His little face was full of excitement and expectation. Grace swallowed hard. As much as she tried to pretend she wouldn't miss the children, she would. They'd broken through her walls with their innocence and honesty, and love. The sooner she could return to work, the better. "Dylan, leave Auntie Grace be. Daddy will take you a little later, okay?" Lizzie ruffled Dylan's dark, wavy hair and raised her brow. "It's all right, Lizzie. I can take him." Dylan jumped up and down and whooped without letting go of Grace's hand. Grace couldn't help herself and let out a laugh. If only she could wind the clock back.
"Can we go now?"
He was still bouncing, and his little face pleaded with her. "All right, Dylan, but what about James and Claire?"
"They're too little. Come on, let's just you and me go."
Ryan appeared from in front of the van, looking as relaxed and handsome as ever in his faded blue jeans and red, white and blue checked shirt. He met Grace's gaze, his eyes twinkling in amusement. "And where is this young man taking you?" Grace chuckled, but Dylan replied before she could.
"To the rides. You can come too."
Dylan grabbed Ryan's hand and tried to drag both Grace and Ryan away from the van. "Whoa, little man. Let's see if it's okay with your mum first." "I said I'd take him, Ryan. It's okay." Grace's heart quickened as she looked into his blue eyes. Okay then, let's go. We'll meet up with you later, Liz. Thanks, Ryan. Good luck with him. And you behave, Dylan, okay? Lizzie chuckled as she raised her brow again, shooting Dylan another warning look.
Okay, Mummy.
His voice was so cute, Grace's heart came close to melting. It seemed surreal walking through the food stalls where delightful aromas of freshly baked treats filled the air, rubbing shoulders with burly Scotsmen proudly wearing their clan's tartan, and listening to the bagpipe music blaring from the hill. But what was more surreal was that she was holding a little boy's hand, and Ryan held the other. Grace fought the overwhelming sense of loss which had been surfacing more every day she stayed. She needed to go home, away from this place that just served to remind her of the life she might have had if only things had been different. Would you like a coffee, Grace? Ryan asked as they passed an area set aside with tables and chairs at the far end of the food stalls. I'd love one, but we'd better take Dylan on a ride first. You're right, we'll come back. They headed for the children's rides and let Dylan pick which ride he wanted to go on. He chose the merry-go-round, and he wanted both Grace and Ryan to go with him. Grace laughed. I've never been on one of these. Well, it's time you did. Ryan dragged her onto the merry-go-round, and after he'd helped Dylan onto a dark brown horse with a cream mane, he helped Grace onto the horse to Dylan's left, a white one with a bright pink mane. Ryan took the horse to Dylan's right. As the music began and the horses rose and fell while circling the carousel, Grace almost forgot herself. How many times as young children had she and Brianna looked with envy at the other children riding the carousel at the local fair? Mum could never afford for them to go on any rides, and Aunt Hilda never let them go. Joy welled in her heart at the pure excitement on Dylan's face. But when her eyes met Ryan's smiling ones, warmth trickled through her body from the tips of her fingers to the bottom of her toes.
Can we ride it again?
Dylan asked, his little face fully animated. Laughing, Ryan ruffled Dylan's hair. Maybe later. Auntie Grace would like a drink, and so would I. Would you like one, Dylan?
Can I get a milkshake?
His eyes sparkled, just like his dad's. Of course. Ryan smiled and took Dylan's hand. It was tempting to slip her hand into Ryan's, but she refrained, and instead took Dylan's spare one. Seated at a table covered with a red and white checkered plastic tablecloth and a vase with a sprig of heather sitting in the middle, Grace found it difficult to look Ryan in the eye. Instead, she paid attention to Dylan. There was something unnerving sitting here with Ryan, almost like they were playing happy families. Nothing was further from the truth.
I like you being here, Auntie Grace. Why can't you stay?
Grace sighed, clasping her hands together and staring at them before slowly lifting her eyes. You know why, Dylan. Auntie Grace has to go back to work. Ryan raised his brow. They had already had this conversation, and she guessed Ryan knew she was running away, and that she didn't really need to go back.
I'm going to miss you.
Grace swallowed hard. I'm going to miss you too, Dylan. Lifting her gaze, she met Ryan's magnetic blue eyes, and her heart pounded. His mouth was twisted in a grin that told her he knew exactly how she was feeling and what she was thinking. She held his gaze for a long moment before tearing her eyes away. He was the most infuriating man. She hated that he had the uncanny knack of seeing through her. We should go find our seats. The events will be starting soon. Ryan toyed with his coffee mug. Good idea. Grace downed her coffee and stood. Come on, Dylan, let's find your parents. She took his hand and didn't wait for Ryan. She needed the safety of numbers. It was foolish to think she could flirt with a man like Ryan and not get hurt. She was falling for him, and fast, and she couldn't let herself go there. The stadium was abuzz with anticipation as the massed pipe bands prepared to enter the grounds. Sitting with Lizzie on one side of her, Ryan on the other, and Claire on her lap, Grace should have been happy. Brianna was sitting with her new friends, including Braden, and looked happy and relaxed. Happy faces were everywhere. Happy faces belonging to happy people. She didn't belong amongst them. Somehow she got through the day. Bagpipes, drums, and Highland flings gave way to caber tosses and hammer throws. Grace laughed and clapped and chatted, but inside she was empty. It was all meaningless. None of them had any idea of the weight she was carrying. How could they? She had told no one, not even Brianna. Why it had resurfaced of late, she didn't know. But her nightmares had increased, especially since being here with such good, kind people. And Ryan. Coming to the Cayley tonight? Ryan asked her as they all made their way back to their vehicles after the main event had finished. He held an umbrella over her head as the smur grew heavier, and she had to fight the overwhelming temptation to slip her arm through his. If only she could welcome his friendship, let everything go. All day her swirling emotions had tormented her, as all her loneliness and guilt welded together to the point she just had to get away or else she'd explode. One more day. She took a deep breath and put on a bright face. Yes, I'm looking forward to it. Great, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in tartan. His eyes sparkled as he opened the door of the van for her. Grace's forehead puckered. I don't have any tartan. I'm only joking. You can wear whatever you want. She let out a small laugh. Okay, I'll see what I have. See you tonight. As she settled into her seat beside the children, Grace let her gaze linger on Ryan as he walked around to the minibus and chatted freely with the students as they all climbed in. He was so relaxed and happy. Something she could never be. Have you had a good day, Grace? Lizzie asked as she finished buckling up Claire. What could she say? No, it's been torture. She couldn't say that. She smiled at Lizzie. Yes, it's been great. And you're going to the Cayley with Ryan, I hear. So it seems. Grace gave a small chuckle. How had she gotten herself into this situation? He's a nice man, Grace. You could do worse for yourself. Grace shrugged. I'm not interested. Lizzie laughed. Yeah, right. Grace met Lizzie's gaze. I'm not interested in him, Lizzie. In him or anyone. Lizzie's expression slipped. Okay, sorry. I was only having a bit of fun. Well, don't. Why was she talking to Lizzie like this? It was like someone else had taken over her tongue, and words she didn't mean tumbled out. She had to get away. She didn't mean to snap at Lizzie of all people. Thankfully, the children's chatter filled the van on the short drive home. When they arrived, Grace excused herself and began packing. What's up with Grace? Lizzie asked Daniel when they sat down for a cup of tea after dinner before getting ready for the Cayley. David and Rosemary were putting the children to bed, having offered to mind them so Daniel and Lizzie could attend the dance. What do you mean? Easing back onto the sofa, Daniel angled his head and slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulled her close. I don't know, but she seems kind of troubled. I think that's the word. She snapped at me in the car. Lizzie ran her hand slowly along Daniel's leg. Daniel straightened. Grace snapped at you. What on earth made her do that? Lizzie shrugged. I just told her she could do worse than Ryan. Daniel laughed. You should know better than that, Lizzie. I remember a time when you told me off for asking if she had anyone special in her life. Lizzie let out a sigh. Yes, you're right. I shouldn't have said anything. But even without that, she seemed on edge more than normal. Daniel rubbed her arm. We just have to keep praying for her, Liz. You know that. We don't know what's going on inside her, but God does. You're right, Daniel. Lizzie straightened. Maybe we should pray for her now? He smiled. Good idea. Let's do it. Taking Lizzie's hand, Daniel bowed his head. Dear Lord, we bring Grace before you. We hoped that by being here amongst those who love you, and amongst your great creation here in the Highlands, that she might have let her walls down and opened her heart to you. We feel saddened that this hasn't happened yet, but Lord, we trust you to continue working in her heart, drawing her closer to yourself, chipping away at the walls she's put up. Lord, we pray that she'll open her heart to your love and peace, and that she'll give whatever is troubling her over to you, the great comforter and healer. Open the eyes of her heart to the truth of the gospel message. May she embrace the sacrifice Jesus made for her when he gave his life on the cross so that she might live. Lord, bless her this day. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And Lord? Lizzie cleared her throat. Give us wisdom to know what to say to Grace, especially as she's planning on leaving soon. I'm sorry for being so thoughtless with her this afternoon. And Lord, we thank you so much for the change in Brianna's life. Thank you for healing her hurts and giving her hope for the future. We're so glad she's opened her heart to you. Continue to strengthen her on a daily basis, so that she won't succumb when temptation comes knocking on her door, as it's bound to do. Amen. Lizzie let out a slow breath as she brushed tears off her cheeks. We have to leave her in God's hands, Liz. I know. I just wish he'd hurry up. Patience, Lizzie. Patience. You know that's not my forte. Daniel lifted his hand and brushed her cheek. His blue eyes twinkled, sending her senses into a tailspin. Yes, but you've come a long way, Lizzie O'Connor. Lizzie chuckled. I guess I have, but he's still got a lot of work to do on me. As he does on me. Lizzie smiled at him. I love you, Daniel, and I love that God brought us to this place. It's hard to remember what life was like before we were here. I feel like we've come home. Home is wherever you are, Liz. You're such a big softy, Daniel. She chuckled as he lowered his lips against hers. But she pulled away before he could kiss her properly. If we're going to the dance, we need to get ready. I guess we do. He gave her another quick kiss and then fixed his eyes on hers as he traced her hairline with the tip of his finger. Later. Nodding, she stretched up and gave him a slow kiss.
Secrets and Sacrifice continues in Volume 3, Chapters 21 to 32. Click below to keep listening.